intern who might want to join?
Right. Okay. So let's kick off. The topic today, again for the Friends, is ministerial conferences and how to view them and improve them and make them more effective from the organization's point of view. Of course, ministerial conferences have always been problematic and created quite a few sensitivities over the years, some high wire acts, some failures, some successes. Although actually, when you stand back and look at the record as a whole, the accomplishments at ministerial conferences are not insignificant over the years, I would say. And even apparent failures such as Seattle or Cancun, going back quite a long time, often led later on to breakthroughs and improvements. So it's all a kind of like a dynamic process, I think. Now, I think most of you will be aware that this is not the first time we've addressed this issue, because at the beginning of June, I think on the 3rd of June, it was in fact Jonathan Freed, who's with us today. Hello, Jonathan. Hosted a really excellent discussion with the ambassadors of Australia and China and Thailand, and also with our own two experts in the area, Cecilia Malmström and Peter Umferkorn. And I thought that was really an excellent event. And kind of, you know, it seems that maybe we might be overdoing it, but it occurred to me that we also have within the group some fantastic resources, particularly in the form of two former directors of the Council and TNC Division. And I thought it would be a bit of a criminal waste not to pick their brains on this issue before we move on. So that's why we've got the session today. And I'm very pleased to welcome Evan Rogerson and Victor Do Prado, both members of the group, of course. And as I said, former directors of the Council and TNC Division. And these two professionals have been at the sharp end of many ministerial conferences. They've been up close and personal, right at the very heart of consultations and deliberations. And in fact, in conversation with them, I think we worked out that they have been closely involved with ministerial conferences starting from 1988, no less, with the midterm review of the Uruguay round at Montreal, all the way up to and beyond the Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference at the end of 2017. So really, these are two people who have got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. And as I say, I thought it would be a criminal waste not to get their point of view and the benefit of their experience. Having said that, I mean, I'm not looking upon this, and nor are they, as some sort of a didactic exercise. I mean, there's no perfect solution in all of these areas. We just want to have a bit of a brainstorm and to get the benefit of their experience. We don't have all the answers, of course. We don't have all of the answers. So we're not approaching it in that way. We just want to listen to these two experts. And in that context, I thought we would try to change the format of our session today somewhat. Instead of having a series of speakers, as we normally do, we build this as a conversation between Evan and Victor. And I'm the moderator, but I intend to take as light a touch as possible in that respect. I do have a bit of experience in ministerial conferences myself, but nothing like the expertise that they have. So I'm going to kind of hand the floor over to Evan and Victor and I'm sure they're going to have a fascinating conversation. I might just chip in now and again to kind of move things along, because there's a lot of topics to unpack actually in this area. But that's the approach. And to start, I thought we might take a chronological approach and begin with the preparatory process for a ministerial conference in Geneva, and what we can learn from past experience in this area. And I'm thinking of a whole range of topics here, but this is not in any way to limit Evan and Victor. But to what extent does the geopolitical and the economic environment affect ministerial conferences and preparations for them? Is there a role for senior officials or vice ministers or intersessional ministerial meetings? Which this is a subject which has been raised by a number of countries. I think Australia and Thailand and some others have mentioned this in the papers that they've written on ministerial conferences. Of course, how to handle concerns about transparency and inclusiveness. That's always been problematic almost every time. And in that context, is there a role for the green room? Or is the green room now out of date and we should move on from that? And also ministerial declarations. We're fond of preparing draft ministerial declarations in Geneva, but they cause a lot of heartache, and you sometimes wonder whether it's actually worth it. So there's a whole host of questions. That's not a limiting list in any way, but so the topic, Evan and Victor, is preparatory processes in Geneva, and we would really like to hear your thoughts on that. So maybe I could hand the floor to Evan in the first instance, and then Victor, you follow on, please.
Okie doke. Thanks, Stuart. I should say at the outset to everyone, I'm just emerging from a bout of COVID, so if I seem even stupider than usual, you'll understand. But I'm not feeling too bad now, so this should be okay. I'm looking very much forward to it. What in thinking about this and discussing it with
the
Stuart,
yellow boxes.
Sorry, can you hear me? And discussing with Victor and Stuart and others beforehand, one thought hit me, and that's that we often say, particularly since we kind of gave up on trade liberalization, that the WTO is about stability and predictability. And yet WTO ministerials are usually anything but stable and predictable. And, something's a bit strange here. And this is one of the kind of underlying themes about what I'm talking about, is how we try and how we draw on the experience of the past to try and make WTO ministerials more stable and predictable in keeping with the sort of general intentions of the organization. And obviously the preparatory process is really key here. We have gone into ministerials in the past in varying stages of preparation and readiness, and I think it's probably not an ironclad rule, but it's, I think, pretty sort of clear that the results of the ministerial have a lot to do with how much preparation you put in. Garbage in, garbage out. And the most successful ministerials have been the ones where we went into them with either no outstanding contentious issues or a small manageable number of clearly identified contentious issues, excuse me, remaining for ministers to decide. The ones that failed were where we handed ministers an undigested mess of things to clear up, and said, righto, here you are, you've got 3 days or 4 or whatever, sort it out. And So preparatory process, absolutely vital. Now, who runs the preparatory process? Clearly, it's the General Council Chair, who is the overall conductor of the orchestra. He or she is given the mandate to do this each time by the General Council, and it is the General Council Chair who passes on the package for action, decisions, whatever it may be, to the Ministerial Conference. So the General Council Chair obviously is the orchestra conductor, and that role is absolutely vital. But of course, the organisation as a whole has to be equally integrated in this preparatory process, or it's going nowhere. The relationship between the DG and the General Council Chair is vital here. The DG has a role as chair of the TNC, although I don't know how active the TNC itself is these days. But nonetheless, on the books, the DG is still chair of the TNC, and that gives the DG a certain set of responsibilities. The TNC reports to the General Council, as do the other subordinate bodies. So they all come together at the level of the General Council Chair. So the General Council Chair has a really important job to do, and it was my good fortune in the 10 years I was in the job up till 2012 to work with some outstanding council chairs, not least Stuart, in preparing for Doha in 2001. And also I'd mention Maria Matus is with us today. Yep. Well, many others, Fred Agar, and also with, and I'll come back to this later, with Shotaro Oshima, the great ambassador of Japan in the early 2000s, who was responsible for the success of the non-ministerial, the 2004 General Council meeting, which achieved things that the Doha, not Cancun ministerial hadn't been able to achieve. So tremendous weight on the council chair, and equally the system generally has thrown up people who are equal to that. So that's important. And obviously the Secretariat has a big role to play here too. And in general, I think certainly the team that I had the pleasure to lead, and I know the same is the case when Victor followed on from me, did a wonderful job in supporting the chair and the others, but all the other branches of the Secretariat too have to handle together. So it's the preparatory process under the General Council Chair, utterly vital, and its task really is to reduce the issues of contention to a minimum. I'll shut up now and let Victor say something. I've got a couple of points to add to that if I can afterwards, Stuart. Thanks.
Thanks, Evan. Hello, everybody. Good to see so many friends in this call. Many former and current staff in the WTO, delegates and members of the Friends of Multilateralism Group. Hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because you're spread around the world. Really nice to participate in this chat. Evan was saying he was he was the director of Council and TNC from 2002 to 2012. That's right, Evan. So 10 years there. And that was followed by 10 years where I had the honor of following Evan on that seat. So from 2012 to 2022. So between the two of us, I guess it's about 20 years in Council TNC. I guess I would say two things to start my chat with you all. The first one is that the Ministerial Conference is a political body, and it's different than many of the committees and other bodies in the WTO, in as much as it's utterly political. And why do I say this? Because of something that Stuart mentioned in his introduction. namely that context matters. I had neighbors in Switzerland. I lived in Communy, in Canton de Vaud, and my neighbors had absolutely nothing to do with the WTO. And sometimes they would ask me, so how is the WTO doing? And I said, I'm really sorry to reply to you with a question. You know what the W in WTO is? And say, yeah, it's world, isn't it? I said, yeah, how's the world doing? Because the way the world is doing has an influence in the way the WTO is doing. And surely the way the WTO is doing has an influence on whatever happens or doesn't happen in ministerial conferences. So what we're living today, 2024, is quite different than what we saw, say, in 1996 in MC1 in Singapore. So very different context. So I think we have to remember that the context matter, and the ministerial conference is a political body. I guess the second thing, and this is a segue to go into the preparation, I guess expectation management is the key word for the preparation of a ministerial conference. And here I also was lucky enough to work with very able and bright general council chairs in the preparation. Jonathan is here. I remember Jonathan having the consultations on choosing between Istanbul and Nairobi for MC10, for example. And these are things that, you know, most people don't even know, but these consultations at the very start of a ministerial conference, even before you started the substantive preparations, are key and usually held in a discrete manner. So I guess here the way to think about this is, what are the roles of the actors that Evan has mentioned? The General Council Chair, actually the most important person in that preparation when you start. The Director General as the chair of the TNC. Once you choose the Ministerial Conference chair, once he or she are appointed as chair of the Ministerial Conference, and that usually takes place pretty much in advance of the Ministerial Conference, the coordination with the MC chair, a minister usually, will be super important. And last but not least, the internal coordination within the Secretariat, plus the whole community, the whole of the ambassadors in Geneva. And I guess here, we can spend some time trying to spell out the roles of each one of these actors. But one thing is for sure, it's easier when they all think or behave in a coordinated manner. When they know each other, when they're calling each other on a first name basis, when they share all of the information. So not only transparency amongst the delegations, but transparency amongst these actors. When the Secretariat is given enough leeway to suggest meetings amongst these actors, when the Secretariat is given leeway, for example, to suggest consultations. And here again, very discrete role, I guess we can say that now, Evan, how much the Secretariat was trying to drive this process from behind the scenes. And I always say, the more discreet, the more effective. I mean, if we weren't seen and recognized at all, that was good. But we know, and the General Council chairs know how much the Secretariat was doing behind the scenes. And the DGs that I at least worked with knew what the Secretariat was doing, plus all of the ambassadors. So these roles are extremely important, and each one has a role: Ministerial Conference chair, DG, General Council chair, Secretariat, in getting the community of ambassadors and ministers to know what they can expect, and perhaps even more importantly, what they cannot expect out of a ministerial conference. Because many times you go to those meetings and the expectations are so high that we are of course, in setting ourselves for some frustration, and that's not good. So I guess one of the questions for the future is, how do we manage those expectations, and how do we avoid the frustration? I mean, why do we keep on setting high expectations and setting ourselves for frustrations? And I go back to what I said in the beginning. This is a political body, so we should have a political view of what a ministerial conference is and manage those expectations. So with this, perhaps I hand it back to you, Stuart, or to Evan.
I just, thanks very much for both of you. It's that's tremendous start to get your feel for these things. Would either of you like to make a comment about utility or futility of green rooms in preparatory process, and about senior official involvement?
Yeah, if I could just come back in there for a couple of things, Stuart. If you don't mind, I'll sort of circle back round to the green room and so on, because it's in the context of what I wanted to say. I agree with everything Victor said. About, I mean, the preparatory process, to focus a bit more on it. We could obviously write a textbook on it, although it'd be completely useless because the context changes every time. But there are no rules, of course, for the preparation of ministerial meetings. The WTO is full of rules, but it doesn't have many rules about how to run its own business. And there are no rules about how to organize, or indeed not much about how to run ministerial conferences. So it's all a basis of sort of trying to remember what worked well in the past, and trying not to repeat some of the more egregious mistakes of the past. And I suppose if a conversation like this has some use, it's that. Clearly, there are some basic principles, it seems to me, in preparing ministerials that we cannot lose sight of. And these were enunciated, I always thought, very well in the preparation of the 2009 ministerial by Maria Matus. The first one was, well, the main principle was what he called the FIT principle, which was full participation, inclusiveness, and transparency. And I mean, that's hard to argue with. Those things all have to be there. Otherwise, you're going to get resentful members and difficulties along the way to the conference, and certainly you're going to get difficulties at the conference because people arrive angry and just get angrier. So those principles are absolutely vital. And the question then is how you action those, how you put those into practice. To which I would say that the other thing we have to do is use, almost sort of make use, the lack of rules is, it's an advantage, it's a disadvantage. I think it's more of an advantage than a disadvantage, because it means that the preparatory process can be flexible and it can be very informal, as long as it keeps an eye on those principles. And I think one thing we have to do is use, whoever's doing it has to use every possible venue for consultation. You know, you've got to play all the keys on the piano. Victor's a pianist, I'm not, but he will know the importance of using all of the whole keyboard. And you know, we're silly if we deny ourselves opportunities for building convergence. And that means all sorts of different, it means big meetings, small meetings, bilateral meetings, you know, phone calls, huddles in corridors, but always coming back to the membership as a whole, making sure everyone's brought along, making sure you build convergence gradually. Another good principle that came out of the 2011 ministerial preparation, which was done by Fred Argar as council chair, who again did a great job, was the principle of incremental convergence, which is, you know, you don't start out ambitious. You build up gradually and progressively, bringing everyone with you from very simple, rather banal statements, you know, things that everyone can agree on. And you get everyone to agree, and the Secretariat goes away and writes it down on a bit of paper and circulates it back to everyone. And they all say, yeah, we all agree. We all love our mother, you know. And then you build on that. You add another layer, you know, and eventually, and you keep on going until you run into resistance. If you run into resistance that can be solved, you have consultations and try and resolve it. If it can't be resolved, well, maybe you give up trying to go down that path and, you know, decide where you got to is as far as you're going to get. But in that way, we were able to get an agreed bit of paper called Elements for Political Guidance, which went forward to the 2011 Ministerial and effectively set out a basis for getting out of the straitjacket of the Doha round, as it had then become, and finishing negotiations on things that we could do, while still respecting the overall mandate, but agreeing that, okay, if there's areas where you can make progress, you make progress. Doesn't mean you're giving up on the whole thing, but you go ahead where you can. And that's what's in that Elements for Political Guidance, which is, I would say, a very important document then and still. And that was the basis, for example, on which the 2013 Ministerial in Bali was able to do the deal on trade facilitation, and on which other deals have been done since, like export competition in Nairobi. And I mean, that paper, that Elements for Political Guidance, was agreed before we got to the Ministerial. It had a consensus before it went. And that was really useful, really important. It meant the Ministerial was pretty uncontroversial, but actually achieved quite a lot. And that was a result of a very painstaking, lengthy preparatory process, as I say, based on so-called incremental convergence and respecting transparency and participation. And it also involved a hell of a lot of work and many, many hours of consultation. And I think that's the other thing that people have to learn, is that, or relearn or remember, I'm not sure it's always remembered these days, is that all this stuff, all this preparation for ministerials involves a lot of thankless late night work in rooms, and it's lengthy, frustrating, time-consuming, maddening, but there's no substitute for it. You're certainly not going to do it by flying around the world lecturing people. And so I'd leave it at that. But just to say that I think that's pretty key. Those two ministerials, 09 and 11, have for me a lot to teach us about preparation and the principles and how you put them into practice. Thanks.
Yeah, Stuart, maybe immediately follow up on that, because during those ministerials, I was in Pascal Lamy's office, you remember. So Evan and I were working hand in hand. So perhaps recall the role of the DG office as well when you were preparing one of those ministerials. That's when I started learning things from Evan. MC8, MC9, incredibly important, actually, already during your time there, Stuart, before the Hong Kong ministerial. And I guess the one principle, if I can repeat what Evan said, but in a different way, is you can never consult enough. You can never have enough consultation. So consult all the time. And since we're talking about this, let's tackle the green room, a name that has been demonized for a while, and in my view, unfairly so, because it is a format. I mean, you basically can call it DG consultations. Now, I guess what people need to understand is that the green room is not a fixed format, unlike many people think. I remember the amount of time that Evan and I spent talking about who should be, and perhaps as important, who should not be in the green room, and draw a list that was, yeah, maybe very similar one to another. There's some usual suspects that are always there, but then you add other people because their roles change. The regional group coordinators, the LDC coordinator, the ACP coordinator, whatever, and depending on the issue that is going to be discussed in the green room, you add or you subtract people, which can be an excruciating work, but needs to be done. And just to reinforce something that Evan said, why deprive yourself of that instrument? Now, it has to be done carefully, because of course those who are not there will always complain. It's a given. But again, I guess I would say, if you're in one of these rows, MC chair, General Counsel chair, DG, Secretariat, I guess you have to have a thick skin. You have to be able to take some hits. It comes with the job, and I guess you have to learn how to make everyone happy, explain and talk, and basically use whatever resources you have to make everybody feel included. Evan mentioned the FIT principle that Mario enunciated, and I think that is still valid today. Now, we have all of these formula, the concentric circles, the variable geometry, whatever. We can talk about geography and geometric formats in whatever way, but the main thing is getting everybody on board and avoid somebody feeling completely excluded. That will surely create problems. One word perhaps on the ministerial declaration. And again, why should we have a ministerial declaration if there's no need for one? Now, there are moments when a ministerial declaration is expected. And here I recall the preparations for Nairobi. Fernando Di Matteo, who is also a member of this group, was the General Counsel chair. And Fernando called some friends and did a exercise in room W. Those of you who are WTO buffs know what I'm talking about. And whoever wanted to be in room W was there. People made submissions to bits and parts of the ministerial declaration. Those bits and parts were consolidated by the Secretariat. You put something on the screen and you start drafting. Did we finish the whole declaration? No, there were some hard nuts to crack. But basically, the ambassadors were then in Nairobi and the ministers were able to finish the ministerial declaration. It was important. It was a milestone. And again, following up on the elements for political guidance, then on the trade, which basically got rid of the single undertaking, as Evan mentioned, paved the way for the trade facilitation agreement. Then what you have in Nairobi is another decision on the elimination of agricultural subsidies. But there's a paragraph in that declaration which clearly says that some people want to keep the Doha agenda and some people don't. So you basically agree to disagree, and that's it. And that has been sort of the situation since then. There's lots of people who basically don't even talk about the Doha round any longer. And what followed was Buenos Aires. We can get that to that in a minute. But for now, let me hand it back to you, Stuart, or to Evan.
Well, thanks very much for both of you. I mean, I think there's some tremendous thoughts in there, incremental convergence, and you can never consult enough. And looking at the green room as sort of DG consultations, and also those thoughts about the ministerial declaration. Thank you very much, both of you. I think following my chronological approach, I'd like to move on a little bit now beyond preparations, although we can come back to that, of course. But I'd like to now ask you to shift the focus a little bit to things such as the venue and frequency of ministerial conferences, which is always a topic for debate. I mean, you know, do we want to continually to have these traveling road shows? Although I guess you could say they show the WTO around the world, since we don't have regional offices and things like that. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on venue, whether we should do these things in Geneva or continue to travel around the world. And then obviously on the frequency thing, some commentators and experts and delegations take the view that it would be better to have more routine annual events like a lot of other international organizations, whereas other people seem to think we need the pressure cooker atmosphere sometimes of periodic meetings in order to take a great leap forward, as it were. So I'd like to get your views on those two issues, venue and frequency of ministerial conference. Which of you, whoever would like to go first, please do so.
Thanks, Stuart. I offered to go first on this because I've got two contrasting views on this. I got a very clear view based on all my experience on the venue question, and I'm a bit agnostic on the other one. On the venue one, I believe, as I've believed for ages, that like the Beatles, we should stop touring. And they decided early on that touring was a mug's game and just made studio albums. And I think that's probably, we're at a slightly different business, but I think not a bad lesson for the WTO. I cannot see for the life of me any valid reason to maintain the traveling roadshow business. It is wasteful in every respect. Money, air miles, anything you like. There's no evidence that it's conducive to better results. It involves, I was just thinking today, I'm sure very few delegations realize this, but the Secretariat, every time you have a ministerial somewhere else, has to pack up essentially its whole documents processing operation and re-establish it somewhere else. This involves tremendous effort, and the people who do it, our documents people, which is the print shop guys, the translators, all the people involved in getting documents out, the admin people, getting documents out quickly and efficiently and accurately and on time, which they do. They do a tremendous job. They're kind of unsung heroes, and they end up going out to wherever it is a week, 10 days before, setting up a parallel operation, often with equipment that isn't compatible out there and stuff that doesn't plug in and things that don't work, and and making things work. And all this is, they always make it work, but it's, why do we do this to ourselves? What are we proving? Do we enjoy these kind of near-death experiences every time? Why on earth would the organization almost uniquely, I think, subject itself to this for its only, political level gathering? I can't see any advantage in it. It's extra cost for delegations. They end up operating far from their Geneva headquarters, their Geneva delegations who are equipped to deal with WTO stuff. So it's inconvenient and costly and inefficient for everybody. And I certainly strongly believe that it would be a major efficiency gain for the organization and its members to just decide, we are based in Geneva, let's do the ministerial conference in Geneva. Let's do it like most international organizations do. Let's have our regular political level meetings at our headquarters. Geneva can cope, it has the capacity, we've demonstrated that before. We don't attract the number of journalists we used to anyhow. And so, let's just stay here and do it. To me, it's a no-brainer. And with all due respect to Stuart's raising the point, I know he's not arguing that, but as a good moderator, he's ventilated it, that it increases the WTO's profile around the world to have a ministerial. Well, I can think of, more cost-effective ways of spreading the good word about the WTO around the world, not least through the WTO's members, who are, by definition, around the world, doing it. I don't think we have to, you don't have to move the print shop every couple of years to do that. So I'm strongly in favour of just once and for all deciding we're doing it in Geneva. The times we've done it in Geneva, it's worked well. And, we should have learned those good lessons. The question of how often you do it, as I say, I'm relatively agnostic about it, although I increasingly see the appeal of, I think it is the Brazilian suggestion, others have made it, that have it once a year. It would help normalize it and help in the overall effort, which I think is important, to kind of de-dramatize the whole thing and make it, while still political and different in that sense, less of a kind of disjunction from the regular work of the WTO, more integrated into the regular work, and hence less of a roller coaster ride every time. So I think I'm coming round to the annual thing, but interested in Victor's views on that.
I'll just interrupt very briefly, Evan, to say that you mentioned the Beatles. I think one of their tracks was A Hard Day's Night, which is very appropriate for a ministerial conference, I think. Victor, sorry, your turn.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks, Evan. Just perhaps a little reminder for the lawyers in the meeting about the legal basis for a ministerial conference. Evan said there's very little guidance in there, and that's true. I mean, ministerial conference, basically, I guess somebody is sharing their screen. I certainly didn't do this. Am I the only one who's getting a...
No, somebody's done it. Could whoever it is please close their...
Right. Anyways, why don't I continue?
Oh, that's it. Okay, you're with us now, Victor. Yeah, we can see you.
Right. So the legal basis, Article 4.1 of the Marrakesh Agreement, very short. Ministerial meetings take place at least once every 2 years. So that gives leeway for annual meetings if if members so decide. And what does the ministerial conference do? Carry out the functions. The functions of the WTO we know are spelled out in Article 3 of the Marrakesh Agreement, and the ministerial conference has authority to basically decide on anything it wants. And then there's rules of procedure in a document called the WTL 161, which is very thin. There's very little in there. And I agree with Evan that this is actually a good thing, because we can adapt. I am a strong believer in a principle of industrial design and architecture. Some of you know me and know that one of my passions is modern architecture. Form follows function. We should have ministerial conferences that are designed to perform a certain function. So if we're going to have a ministerial meeting abroad, with all of the bells and whistles and with all of the political drama that takes place during those days abroad, that should perform a certain function other than simply having everybody go around the world. I know it's difficult, but maybe members could think twice before agreeing to hold a ministerial meeting abroad, to think, what are we going to do abroad? Do we need political pressure? Do we need political drama at this stage because we're so close to an agreement that that sparkle is going to take place there? It is rarely the case. And I sort of tend to agree with Evan that doing this in Geneva is more productive, easier, and not only because of the print shop, Evan is right, but still, it's not only the print shop, it's the document having the documents go through the system is demands a type of software. It's pretty tricky on. I once had to explain to Azevedo that it took 2 hours for a chair proposal at Nairobi to get from his desk to the system so that everybody could check this in their computers. It has to be translated, it has to go through it. So it's not as easy as it sounds, even if we're not printing things as the way we did. Still, it is complicated. But beyond the logistical constraints and difficulties, why are we doing this? There should be a function for the ministerial. Now, abroad. Otherwise, just do it in Geneva. When we were preparing for this, and I'm sorry, Evan, I'm going to say a phrase that you said, and I thought it was brilliant. The WHO meets every year in Geneva, and it doesn't cure a disease every year. Why would you expect the WTO to come up with an agreement every time it meets? It doesn't make any sense. When there are agreements to be done, fine. But when there aren't, let's have the meeting. Let's talk about the state of the world. I'm sure there's plenty for ministers to do and coordinate and give direction to the future of the organization. As for the annual frequency, I'm again agnostic. If you're going to do this in Geneva, why not? I would surely not recommend going abroad every year.
Thank you very much. Well, we're doing okay. We've halfway through the session, I think. And I just want to say that when we have, we've got a couple more topics to discuss. And then, of course, we're going to open the floor to questions. So either people can put their hand up on the relevant app, or indeed make a comment. And I see some comments are already beginning to come in the chat. But let's move on now. And we talked a little bit about venue and frequency. Now I would like to ask our two guests, or not guests actually, because they're members of the group, our two interlocutors, about processes actually at ministerial conferences, because these also have been problematic over the years. I remember the session that we had on the 3rd of June, which Jonathan so ably moderated. We heard some impassioned pleas from the ambassador of Thailand about the need to be more inclusive. And the question that often comes up, which delegations ask, and I, as a permanent representative previously, have asked it myself: what will my minister do at a ministerial conference? And this is important stuff for ambassadors and for delegates. They need to their minister to go away with a feeling that they've contributed to the conference and got something out of it. So that's, how do we manage that? And we, of course, normally we have sort of formal and informal tracks at ministerial conferences. And how does that feed into the "what will my minister do" syndrome? And another thing that's, I think, come up from time to time, although not all the time, is the relationship between the Director General and the chair of the conference, which is obviously a key thing. They need to be on the same page. So I'd like to now turn to those sorts of issues and ask our Victor and Evan for their views and the benefit of their experience in terms of the processes actually at ministerial conferences. So I don't know, Victor, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, why don't I? Some people have often asked this question: what is my minister going to do in a ministerial conference? Listen, we had one ministerial conference, MC9, right, Evan, in Geneva, which was a regular ministerial, as we called it. We had sessions of discussions that were pre-cooked. We scheduled those substantive discussions for ministers. They came, they discussed, and sorry, it was MC7, not 9. And it was very smooth and pretty successful. So not again, I go back to expectation management. If you tell the ministers you're going to go to Geneva, there are 3-4 sessions where these issues are going to be presented and discussed. Why would a minister feel that they have nothing to do? They would need staff to prepare them for those discussions, and it also means that the Secretariat has to prepare substantively those discussions, which are not discussions where you're expecting a conclusion or a final conclusion at the end, but they're usually very helpful, if anything, in educating ministers about what's happening in Geneva. So I still think that there's a lot of sense in bringing ministers together to have those types of substantive discussions. I will refrain at this point from going into the relationship between those main players. I would only insist on this. If they are not aligned in the way of thinking and in their objectives, you're going to have a problem. So a minister that is chairing a conference needs to come to Geneva 1, 2, 3 times before the conference, meet ambassadors, meet the DG, try to think about the ministerial meeting in a very thorough manner, and that ensures success. Now, if you are lucky enough to have a minister that understands the business like Amina Mohammed did in Nairobi, that helps a lot. But that's not necessarily the case. In Bali, we had a minister that didn't know the WTO very well, and it still worked pretty well. But again, the relationship between the minister, the GC chair, the DG was very, very smooth, and they knew each other quite well. Evan, over to you.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, agreed. I think one of the keys to me for the question of maintaining the, as it were, the fit principle throughout ministerials, where it should continue, is of course what you're trying to do at the ministerial. It's, as you say, expectation management. It's also a question of the substance, what's on the table, and excuse me, how successfully you manage the preparatory process. And there is, I think you could sort of graph a direct relationship between the complexity and sort of remaining difficulty of unresolved issues that go to the ministerial, and the problems that you're going to have with transparency and participation and inclusiveness at the ministerial. Because the more the ministers are overburdened with unresolved issues, which will usually end up with lots of little secretive groups around the place trying to crunch them, which is almost inevitable if you're trying to do something like that in less than a week, then you are going to have problems with transparency. We had, with all with the best will in the world and with an excellent ministerial chair, we had some problems with transparency, for example, in Nairobi. I wasn't in the Council division there, but I was there in another role. And that was because, there were still some pretty big unresolved issues which demanded, which led to some little groups going on for hours and hours and hours, and others getting justifiably upset. We heard from the Thai ambassador last month about similar problems at the last ministerial, when there wasn't anything like as substantive issues on the table. And nobody, believe me, being in the Secretariat at the front end of these sort of grievances is no fun. As Victor said, you need a thick skin, and it's no fun for, I can imagine, for delegates who have to tell their minister that he's not invited to some meeting, or there's a meeting going on that he hasn't been told about. So the most effective way, I think, one can reduce the transparency and inclusiveness problems is to minimize the number of outstanding issues that might be such as to require intensive small consultative processes at the ministerial. So that's I think a very important thing. It's kind of the flip side of it's moving from expectation management to kind of, you know, reality management, almost you might say agenda management. And the DG-MC chair issue, I'd agree with Victor, it's vital. The only thing, just add, I mean, because the General Council chair doesn't have a role at the ministerial, his or her role ends when they hand over the package to the council chair, the ministerial chair. Then the DG and the DG's team, which is people like the director of the council division, who's the secretary of the council, his or her team, and all of the secretariat staff who are there, they are the ministerial conference chair's team. And in general, in my experience, certainly the ministerial conference chair relies very much on the secretariat team, not on his or her own people so much. Indeed, very often they're quite happy to have somebody else take the responsibility. And that's a very important role. And if there isn't a good relationship between the DG and the conference chair, and the secretariat and the conference chair more generally, then again, it's a handicap to the smooth functioning of the conference. Thanks.
Thank you both. That's great. I think you've given us a good feel there. I noticed in particular, you know, Victor mentioned why expect the WTO to come up with an agreement every time the ministers meet, and I thought Evan's point also about, you know, the more unresolved issues you go into a conference with, the more likely it is that you're going to run into transparency problems. So that goes back, of course, to the necessity for an efficient parity process. So, okay, moving on to the last bit of the conversation that I wanted to have. And then after that, I think we've got a healthy chat going, I can see in the chat box. And then, you know, people might want to put up their hand and ask a question. But before that, the last piece of the chronological order that I'd noted was the question of outcomes of ministerial conferences and decision making. This is a very live issue again. I think we've had recent papers from Singapore and others about the need for so-called responsible consensus. And I read that I think China has recently put forward a proposal about, you know, in a similar vein. So clearly this is a live issue. You know, we're wedded to the consensus principle, it seems, or do you two guys disagree with that? Or how can we make it easier to build consensus in terms of outcome at ministerial conferences? And then, are there pros and cons for you know, a declaration versus a chair's statement? We've had both, of course, although I think clearly the priority has been given to declarations, if possible. And then, what can we learn from other international governmental organizations, I wonder? I mean, some of them, like the WHO, which was mentioned, have an executive committee, which we don't have in the WTO. So that's a whole area there. How can we improve our decision making so that ministerial conferences can be more meaningful? So who would like to go first on that?
Why don't I try my hand, Stuart? And perhaps I'm going to be a bit blunt here because it seems like things were more or less managed until, say, Nairobi, Buenos Aires. And I guess, yeah, things started going really difficult after Bali, with the issue of the protocol for the trade facilitation agreement that was difficult to adopt at the General Council. So you had an agreement at Bali, but then adopting the protocol for that agreement in Geneva became an issue. After Nairobi, things became again very difficult with the decision on the elimination of agricultural export subsidies. Those of you who know the history know what happened there. I guess when things became really tough is when you moved from a type of approach that was, I will give you this if you give me that, to an approach, I will not give you this unless you give me that. So at the moment you move to a negotiating approach that some of us call hostage taking, then things become quite dramatic. And what happened in Buenos Aires was a group of members said, we are going to free ourselves from that position of hostage taking. And that's where you had the JSIs. Now, we haven't been able to figure out how do we incorporate the JSIs into the WTO framework. This is the issue. But again, I will recall the context. The context out there is not easy. But funny enough, this doesn't have to do with, say, the war in Ukraine. And I don't need to spell out what this has to do with. But I guess there is an issue there when the negotiating approach moves to a hostage-taking type of approach. That has been very detrimental to the organization. If you look at the traction that the JSIs have had, the investment facilitation for development, the MISMI's JSI, there's the e-commerce one as well, there's other initiatives. We'll have to figure out how we do that business. I find it difficult to believe that all of the effort that, for example, was done in terms of investment facilitation will lead to nothing. I think this is not realistic, including politically. So something has to give in there. I guess I've been sort of direct enough and have enticed Evan to make some comments about this.
I'm looking to, it'd be nice to find things that we disagreed violently about, but I certainly agree. I'd actually made myself a little note this morning that the consensus question really is in the process of being answered by the JSIs. And yeah, that's it. You said it. I've always thought that having a sort of head-on formal assault on the consensus principle was a really dumb idea, because it would not only tie us up in possibly years of discussion, but also, of course, expecting to get a consensus to move away from consensus would be pretty optimistic, it seems to me. So I think the consensus principle is here to stay, but it doesn't mean that some members are not gonna feel the need to find creative ways of working around what Victor quite correctly referred to as hostage taking, which goes very much against the sort of principles that I think the recent paper from Singapore and others referred to as responsible consensus. In general, I think the WTO does best when it doesn't try and formalize its processes too much, because some people love nothing more. Some members, we can all nominate who we think they are, like nothing better than to get tied up in some abstruse constitutional argument that gums up the works forever, because maybe they don't want things to move forward very much. So it is better if we can find ways, creative workarounds for these problems, and the JSI initiatives seem to me to be one way in which a number of members are answering this question. In the same way, I don't think the idea of having some kind of executive committee in a formal sense is ever going to fly. I mean, this idea was around 30, even 40 years ago. There were various kind of select consultative groups in the old GATT days, but they all fell over because of problems of inclusiveness. And I think any attempt now in the much broader WTO to formalize any sort of executive committee would be doomed to fail. And again, would just tie us up in endless, not very productive negotiation. So I think we just get on with doing what we've got to do. It's not very satisfactory that the JSIs, the issue of how they relate to the rest of the WTO hasn't yet been sorted out, but that again needn't impede people moving ahead where they can. And that's surely the main point, is to make progress in the organization wherever we can. And if we're going to learn anything, your other point, Victor, learn anything from other IGOs, I think we've touched on a bit of that already. Victor reminded me of my line about the WHO. Thanks, Victor. You can have that now. I make you a present of it. Is that yeah, I mean, this is not to say that everyone else is perfect or anything, but we inherit. I think the trouble is the WTO inherited from its GATT predecessor this habit of having occasional ministerials which were always about some big ticket item. And, you had a ministerial when you were launching around or finishing around. And that was the sort of cultural background. And I don't think we've quite got out from under that culture yet, that every ministerial has to be a big deal. It's got to be about something big. It's got to produce, something, or it's either, we always cast it in success or failure terms. Does the International Labour Conference, is it, or Labour Assembly? It's World Health Assembly and International Labour, conference, let's say. Apologies to ILO people, but whatever, the ILO's annual meeting. I mean, are they classed as successes or failures? I don't. It doesn't come across that way. So I think the more we can do to regularize and normalize our meetings, the better. And I think that way there'll also be a more continuous and productive influence on the regular work of the WTO, which after all has to go on between ministerials. And sometimes, as I said at the beginning, talking about 2004, some of our best work has been done actually outside ministerials. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Evan and Victor again. Well, the floor is open now. I'm going to open the floor if anybody wants to stick their hand up. Jonathan, I see, has raised his hand, which is good to see, because he was in charge of the previous session. So hopefully, and also has his own very deep experience in this area, as well as in other organizations. So Jonathan, can I give you the floor?
Sure, and thank you, Victor and Evan and Stuart, for your reflections and enlightenment. I have no disagreement, but just want to offer a few complimentary observations. First, I think we suffer a bit, not from the disagreement on Doha, but the notion that trade bargaining requires net win-win. So there's inevitable linkage between one issue and another, or one subject and another. So trade-offs to some extent are inevitable, and it's a little difficult for countries and members to get used to saying, oh yeah, we can go ahead on this issue, even though what's really of concern to me is in another sector, and we're not making progress on that, whether it's Brazil on agriculture, India on public stockholding, the list goes on of linkages. So we've got to overcome that. And indeed, the lesson from other organizations, take the IMF as the closest analog, annual meetings, business as usual. It doesn't culminate in the conclusion of a round or a package. It's whatever needs to be done that year. by finance ministers, and those are pretty fundamental political issues often, of sovereign debt or otherwise, and nobody bats an eyelash. So annual meetings may be the route forward if you can overcome the overhang of a single undertaking or cross-sectoral bargaining. Second observation, none of you touched on the role of capitals intersessionally, whether ministerial or deputy ministerial, and we shouldn't forget the importance of consensus building that takes place in other fora. The traditional Swiss mini-ministerial on the margins of Davos, APEC ministers, BRICS, G7, G20, and so on are all places where a forthcoming ministerial agenda gets aired. And each of those has preparatory processes that don't necessarily involve the Geneva ambassadors at the table, but the capital-based deputy ministers and senior officials. So in talking about preparatory processes, I think you have to analyze more broadly where these dialogues occur. Final observation on so-called executive committees. There are various caucuses and informal groupings that will continue whether you declare them as legitimate or not. You can go back to the CG18, the De La Paix group, the ongoing, I think it's ongoing, the Breakfast group, which is quite a cross-section that doesn't exist. And Victor will recall, I tried an experiment that I still think has some merit of the General Council chair holding regular meetings with all the council and committee chairs as sort of a coordinating body that helps ensure among the members, without being totally dependent on the Council Secretariat, that there is coordination across the various groups on an ongoing basis. So I've often used the analog of corporate governance. The IMF has its IMFC, a group of 24 representing 188 countries. Nobody balks at that. The UN has the General Assembly versus the Security Council. Every other organization has something resembling a board of directors. The WTO has shareholders meetings and no real board of directors that defaults as a result to the DG rather than leadership by the members themselves. That deserves some thought in the longer term. Anyway, just some complimentary observations. I know there's others waiting in line.
Great points. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. We'll put those to Evan and Victor in a moment. Let's just pick up a few more points before we go back to those two. Peter Ungverkorn.
Hi, thank you both, and thank you, Stuart. My thoughts are drawing together some trends of what you said, all of you, over time. I mean, Evan and Stuart, I think, started off talking about how failed ministerials often ended up in successful meetings back of the General Council, for example, back in Geneva. And Victor spoke about the change of mood to become more of a hostage taking. And my question is really about whether there's anything that the people who are organizing ministerials or the General Council can do to interact with members on certain issues. And I'll give you a really hypothetical example because it worked out differently. 2004 worked not just because of the way it was arranged, it was because the EU decided to drop 3 red lines on the Singapore issue. So there was only trade facilitation left, and that made it a lot easier for the membership to agree to whatever was going to go forward. And good of the EU to have done that in a hostage-taking climate. Someone in that position might have said, actually, these are our red lines. We stick by them, and not only do we stick by them, we want it now at the next ministerial conference. And if you don't give it to us at the next ministerial conference, we're going to tear everything else up. And my question in terms of organization is there anything that the Secretariat, the DG, the General Council Chair can do to talk to the members who take hostages, or is it really entirely up to them? Up to the members, I mean.
Thanks very much, Peter. We'll come back to that one. And Alan, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, and I much appreciate the discussion, especially from folks who are steeped so deeply in what has taken place in the past. I was only inside in the WTO era for one ministerial, and that was at Buenos Aires in 2017, and otherwise on the outside at Hong Kong, Cancun, and the Uruguay round. Launch in 93, and in 90 the attempt to launch it in Brussels. Here's just a thought. The great success of the WTO is doing things fully multilaterally when they can, and they're trying to with respect to Fish 1 and Fish 2. But like-minded, the ministerials are an opportunity nowadays for like-minded to get together. So there's been an increasing number who have talked about fossil fuel subsidies, led primarily by New Zealand, but others as well. And eventually that will crystallize into something better and broader. And the JSIs are brilliant because these members said, we're going to announce this to all of you. You're all welcome to join. We're doing this in the context of the WTO. It's within the multilateral trading system. While some of you don't think so, it is fully, and it is a way forward. I mean, the United States is sort of not necessarily blocking everything, but an absentee more often than it's in the leadership position. That's a big change. And the middle-sized countries, and I count the EU as acting like a middle-sized, middle grounder country. They say we've got ways of moving forward, and we're gonna do it for the sake of transparency, for the sake of inclusiveness. We're gonna do it at the WTO, and the ministerial is an opportunity to get these things done, and to encourage that, because fully multilateral agreement, especially if we have an election in the U.S. that brings Trump back, not going to happen with the U.S. In any very positive role. China has not stepped forward, and the EU has not stepped fully up. So I think it's a great opportunity for those who are like-minded and positive to move forward on a multilateral stage, and like reactions to that. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Alan. So back to you two, Evan and Victor, in no particular order. The comments from Jonathan about being difficult for countries to go ahead on issues individually sometimes because of linkages, and the role of capitals intercessionally, and the executive committee board idea, and Peter's point about hostage taking. Is there anything that can be more proactively done to stop that sort of thing? And Alan's point about like-minded going ahead and JSIs, all fascinating subjects that we could spend a lot of time discussing. But if you can cover them briefly, it would be great. Evan, do you want to start? Oh, you're muted, Evan.
I seem to have muted myself. Okay, the relief of many. Good. Thanks for the questions, and I think they all go in a similar direction. And grateful to Jonathan for filling in a gap that we had left. We'd talked about this earlier, but we just, I guess, didn't get around to it in the time. That, of course, the intersessional processes are really important, and particularly, I would say, the senior officials track is very important and has been very productive in the past. Again, like with all these things, and it's coming back to earlier remarks about consultative processes, including not least the green room, is that you've got to have a pretty good idea what you're having a meeting for and what you hope to get out of it. You don't just have a senior official meeting for the sake of having one. You hope to try and focus these things and get the maximum use out of them, but they are an important part of, if you like, they're another note on the keyboard that we have to play. So absolutely right on that. I certainly agree very much with Alan that the JSIs are encouraging. I can't see any other way for the organisation to move forward under current circumstances, which are not propitious for multilateral agreement and don't look like they're going to get much better in the short term. It'd be nice if we, if we did have an executive committee, it could be handy, but I remain skeptical that we could ever agree in any formal way about how to do that. And I query whether it's really something that is worth spending an awful lot of time on. I think continuing to make use of informal processes, Jonathan noted a few of them, is probably as good as we're going to be able to do. And I think it was Peter's point about could the Secretariat and or chairs help kind of resolve the hostage-taking behaviour and so on. Well, I mean, I'm sure the Secretariat continues to do what it can to mediate and be a sort of honest interlocutor and a facilitator. Peter Sutherland always used to describe his role as a facilitator. In his case, he had a fairly muscular interpretation of what a facilitator meant. And I'm sure that the Secretariat will keep on doing that and that chairs will, but ultimately, only members can negotiate. And it's if one or other member have decided they really are quite happy to just tie everything up in knots, well, short of some major external pressures, external to the WTO, I mean, I don't think there's a hell of a lot that can be done. The Secretariat obviously can't, or the DG or the chairs can't be seen to be taking sides. Their role can go so far, but no further. Over to you, Victor.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks to Jonathan, Peter, and Alan for those questions. Jonathan, you're right, and Evan mentioned it. When we were chatting amongst the three of us, Stuart, Evan, and I, we did mention all of these preparatory meetings. But when you were mentioning it, it just pinged back to me. I attended some of the Davos meetings on the side of the World Economic Forum hosted by the Swiss. And I remember a few of the first ones back in the 2000s that were more or less productive. The last one I witnessed, ministers were reading statements. So you had just a small number of ministers, and they were still reading statements. I always had this image of one of those ministers going into a romantic dinner and getting out a piece of paper and reading a declaration to whoever that minister was talking to. I mean, can people finally talk as human beings talk? As we are talking, I'm not reading from anything. Evan is not. Stuart is not. You guys ask questions without reading from any script. It seems like some ministers don't know how to talk. So I question not the format. Yes, having mini ministerials, be it on the sides of the OECD meeting in Paris, where the Australians host, or the Swiss hosted, or whatever. All of these formats are great. As I said, we cannot consult enough. However, you need to prepare for this. And people, I guess, need to come to these meetings with a minimum of willingness to talk and not only read from a pre-prepared statement. So the format in and of itself, I guess, is relevant, less relevant than the attitude and the ability to discuss these issues in an informed way. Alan, I completely agree with you. We were together in Buenos Aires. We saw how the JSIs were important, how this idea of a like-minded group of countries was the only way out, actually. There was nothing else that could be done given the hostage taking. So completely agree with you. The question now is, where do we go from here, right? And I guess none of us, well, I don't have a magic formula for this, but clearly this is something that, in my view, needs to be pushed. So completely in agreement with you. Peter, is there anything we can do? I guess not at our level, but when I think about what made Bali work, the trade facilitation agreement, when there was some hostage taking, was to elevate the level. So we would, and mind you, here is something that I guess Stuart was reminding us before the meeting, the fact that the Ministerial Council chair, so the minister chairing the meeting, is resorting on secretariat assistant and not on their own domestic assistants to support them during a conference. So during a conference, the ones who are supporting or assisting the chair are not his or hers only assistants or advisors. It's us, the secretariat. So yes, get together with the minister, get together with the DG, the General Council chair, and say, listen, we're not going to solve this at our level, meaning minister. What does this mean? The chair of the conference calls their head of government or head of state, and this is elevated to that level. Now, it did work in Bali. Whether this is always going to work is a question mark. And you can only bother heads of government and heads of state at certain points in time. Surely they're not going to be available at all times. But short of this, I really don't see much that can be done. Finally, on the issue of a executive board, I guess I'm very much in line with Evan. You must have noticed by now there's not much that we disagree amongst the two of us. The WTO has this informality that was inherited from the GATT times. It has served us well. It needs to be done with, let's say, a bit of a political touch. DG calls ambassadors, the DG calls ministers, and gets guidance. You can have, I guess, the same function as an executive body by having the DG convene meetings and talk to people without the formality of an executive body. It's not the executive body in and of itself. It's what it does and how it performs. And I guess it can perform in an informal way. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you again, both of you. Well, we've kind of come to the end of the session, actually, so I think we should be wrapping up. So a very good question from Robert Wolf in the chat, which is, one, is the work program on agriculture important for the trading system? And two, can it reach conclusion as a JSI? Thanks very much, Robert. I mean, it would be great. I think this is maybe for another session. In fact, we should try and organize something on that. I'm a bit, although it's a great question. Evan has said in answer on the chat, yes, it's important for the trading system. Can it reach conclusion as a JSI? Probably not. And Evan has said very, very quickly. But I think maybe Stuart, we shouldn't go there.
If I can just interrupt, I'm aware of a Brazilian paper that has been presented to the General Council for the next General Council meeting on agriculture, which might be an interesting development.
Okay. I think we probably shouldn't go there right now, although it's a fantastic question. But we've come to the end of the session, and I think all I can say really, it's difficult to sum up, but it's interesting, I think, that Evan and Victor, with their vast experience and expertise and wisdom over more than 20 years, kind of think roughly similarly, or I think there are differences in nuance, but they think remarkably similarly in various ways in terms of, you know, expectation management and putting in the hours in consultation to get convergence, not trying to tackle big constitutional issues in a very direct and headlong way. I think they also kind of agreed, although not 100% perhaps, that the traveling roadshow is not a great idea, and that we may be able to look at more routine annual meetings as opposed to saving it up for a high wire act every now and again. So, but there were lots of nuances along the way, and it's beyond me to summarize such a rich discussion. All I can say is that I hope you've all enjoyed it and got something out of it. I certainly got a lot out of it, and really, really pleased to have Victor and Evan with us today. Thank you very much, you two. It's been a great discussion, and really heartfelt thanks. And with that, I'll now close the session. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time, no doubt. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Stuart. Bye.